Hello and welcome to Genealogy Gems podcast episode number 282. I'm Louise Cooke, and I'm so glad you're joining me here today. In this episode, we're going to be digging into newspapers, and I've got two interviews for you that I think are really just chock full of great ideas. The first one is with Jenny Ashcraft. She's from newspapers.com. She's been a visitor on the Genealogy Gems podcast and our YouTube channel. She's going to be sharing 5 of her top newspaper tips. And in fact, I got to tell you, that interview actually has a whole lot more in it as well. She is just a wealth of information and an amazing storyteller. And she's going to be sharing some of the stories that she uncovered using newspapers. And in fact, as you're listening, be sure to head over to the show notes for this episode again, episode number 282. You can head to our website, genealogygems.com, and under podcast, just go to the podcast page and click on episode 282. On the show notes page, you can follow along if you'd like and actually see the clippings of the newspaper articles that she uncovered, but she really explains it so well in this interview. And I think these strategies are going to help you find the same kinds of wonderful gems. And of course, if you are a premium member, I hope you are, you'll be able to download the cheat sheet version of the show notes for this episode. My second guest is Shannon Combs-Bennett, and she's going to be talking specifically about obituaries in newspapers. And again, the depth of knowledge that she has, the history she's going to be able to share of obituaries, and some really clever strategies for uncovering a lot more than just a cursory look for obituaries in newspapers. She's really going to help you find them and pull them out of the nooks and crannies of websites and archives and other places. So I think these two interviews just dovetail together really nicely. So without further ado, let's get started with Jenny Ashcraft from newspapers.com. Vital records like birth, marriage, and death records are critical for family history research. But newspapers can also provide the stories and the context that help bring your ancestors' experiences to life. Here to share her top newspaper search strategies is Jenny Ashcraft. She's from newspapers.com. Hi, Jenny.
Hi, thanks for having me, Lisa.
Thanks so much for being here. You know, newspapers can sometimes be a bit more effort, I think, to search for. So before we jump into your search strategies, I really want to lay the foundation. I'd love to hear from you why you think that newspapers are worth the effort.
Well, newspapers really were the social media of their day. They were the number one source for news. When the Civil War started, people found out through the newspapers. There was a huge solar storm in 1859, and colorful auroras lit the sky in the middle of the night, as bright as day. And where did people go to figure out what was going on? The newspapers. And newspapers reported on local news, like who was visiting from out of town and who was on the sick list. They reported on tragic accidents and deaths and births and marriages and family reunions. Newspapers provide details about your family history that, for me, brings such a sense of gratitude. I have learned things about my ancestors through newspapers.com that just amaze me. I stand in awe of the challenges they faced, and each time I search, I'm reminded that I drink every day from a well that I did not dig.
That's so true. I bet you found a lot of gems in your job, which is probably just a dream job for most genealogists working at newspapers.com. What kinds of things have you found?
Well, let me share a quick personal story. And you're right, It is kind of a dream job. It's so fun. You know, my third great-grandfather and his brother immigrated to the United States in 1866. They were just 16 and 20 years old. As they were boarding their ship in Germany, the first ship became overcrowded. They ushered some of the passengers onto a second ship, and in that chaos, these two brothers became separated and ended up on different ships. They would not see each other again for years. Well, Carl Fink arrived here in the United States alone at just 16 years old. He made his way to Illinois, where he eventually became a farmer. He got married. He had 9 children. And I just learned a lot about his life through newspaper articles. He died in 1918, but I had never seen a photograph of him. I have searched newspapers.com, and I thought I had seen every available story about Carl Fink. But one day I came across a photograph, and it was printed in a 1966 paper, nearly 50 years after his death. The photo was originally taken in 1885, and it shows Carl Fink and his 4 oldest sons with their horses. It was published under a headline, Sketches from Yesterday. Well, you can just imagine what an absolute thrill to find the only photograph that I have ever seen of this ancestor.
That's amazing. Oh my gosh, you just must have been doing a genealogy happy dance all over your house. Wow.
You know it.
Fantastic. Okay, well, now you have whetted our appetites. I'd love to hear, what are some of your best strategies that you use when you're doing your newspaper research?
Well, I think the best thing to do is to just start on the homepage, type your ancestor's name in the search box, and one thing you have to remember is use the name how it would have appeared in the newspaper. If your ancestor was named, let's say, Charles Ellis Roper, he may be referred to as Chaz Roper or C.E. Roper or possibly C. Ellis Roper. Try all kinds of variations until you find success. And then next, try to narrow your results by location. Did Charles live in South Carolina? Well, you can narrow the results by the state, the county, the city, even a specific newspaper. And you can also filter those results by dates. Once you have found your ancestor, then the magic begins. The connections just start to flow. Back then, families tended to stick together, so you will often find relatives living nearby. Newspapers are a great way also to identify our female ancestors. As genealogists know, researching women can be hard. They were often referred to by their husbands' names. But, through my research, I have learned that Mrs. Mary Mitchell is really my direct ancestor, who was Mary Miller. She married James Mitchell, and in this clipping, we learn that she died at the home of her sister, Mrs. John Weimer. Well, I know that this is Martha Miller Weimer, my 3rd great aunt. One of the most amazing ways to learn about our ancestors is through obituaries and wedding announcements. Using machine learning algorithms, newspapers.com has developed a technology to identify 250 million obituaries and 67 million marriage announcements in our archives. You may have seen hints for these on your ancestry trees. You can now go to newspapers.com and search for all of your ancestors in either the obituary index or the wedding index. Now, these records are full of wonderful family details and relationships. For example, that last clipping talked about Mrs. John Weimer. Well, I know that Mrs. John Weimer is my 3rd great aunt, who was Martha Miller Weimer. So I want to go to the obituary index and search for Martha. So I'm just going to type in her name and see what I can find. Well, I come up with 16,000 results. Now that's going to take some time to go through, but one thing so cool is I can go to this result type and click on the obituaries, and now I'm in the obituary index, and it looks like I have 4 results. The dates are all the same. These all 4 are obituaries for my ancestor, Martha Weimer.
So it found him also in different papers. It looks like one might be from Pennsylvania, another from Indiana, or Indiana, Pennsylvania. Oh, okay.
Indiana County, Pennsylvania.
Wow.
Yes.
Fantastic. And can you also click on the map? Will that also narrow in location?
Yes. Now, I'm going to back up and show you something kind of cool. When I first came up with those results for Martha Weimer, over on the map, you will see that there's different shades, gradations of pinks and reds. Now, it means that the lighter color states has Martha Weimer in there, but maybe a fewer number. There's just 5 in Colorado, 9 in Wyoming. Well, Martha, who really is from Pennsylvania, there's 5,000 mentions of Martha Weimer. So that state of Pennsylvania has been highlighted as a red to show you that there's a concentration of her name found in newspapers in Pennsylvania.
That's really handy. And it's also handy if by chance she were from another state originally or had a lot of family in another state, because then there's a possibility that her obituary could be shared in a newspaper from her previous hometown or something. So you could have a chance just to zero in on those states.
And you know, Lisa, that happened all the time. And as a matter of fact, on this woman, Martha Weimer, she actually moved from Pennsylvania to Nampa, Idaho. And when she died, these obituaries were printed in the Pennsylvania paper where she came from and not in the Nampa paper.
That's a great example. Now, I know that one of the things that folks often have trouble with is passenger lists, immigration information. Newspapers could be a source for that, could it not?
Absolutely. Newspapers is a great source for that. You know, before air travel became more common in the 1950s, ships were the primary mode of intercontinental travel. And one of the most important records we know for tracking our immigrant ancestors is a passenger list. Well, passenger lists include things like the name and their origin, where the ship, the voyage originated, a passenger's birth date, departure date, arrival date. So what is so cool is you can take those details that you find on a passenger list, take those over to newspapers.com and learn all types of insights about their journey. For example, what if you wanted to know, why did my ancestor immigrate? What caused them to come? Well, a search of newspapers might provide insights into events that led to your ancestors' immigration. For example, if you look in our Irish newspapers in the 1840s, you're going to find heartbreaking stories about the potato famine. And there's a clipping where the newspapers are reporting in a specific parish the number of deaths in that parish. And it says, number of same to be known to be occasioned by the famine, about 200. And several instances have occurred in this parish where almost all the members of families being carried off from the effects of the famine. So this can just help you understand why your ancestor may have chosen to immigrate to begin with.
I've even had success using the name of the ship and searching for that to then try to, and maybe it doesn't name my ancestor, but I could find information potentially about the voyage.
You absolutely can. And I love when I have the name of the ship, which is on the passenger list, being able to take that information and the coordinating dates and go start searching for that ship in newspapers.com. What was the voyage like? You might find about it in newspapers.com. Were there rough seas? Did people die during the journey? Newspapers would often report on conditions of the passage, illness on the ship, weather, deaths. And occasionally we might even find dramatic stories. One of them that comes to mind was the Ocean Monarch. The Ocean Monarch was an immigrant ship that departed from Liverpool in 1848, bound for Boston. Well, during the journey, a fire broke out on the ship and it just started to engulf the ship. So these passengers jumped into the ocean and 180 of them perished. And the newspapers are just filled with these dramatic survivor accounts. And some of them just broke my heart. I remember reading one about a mother who was clinging to her little baby, hanging onto some debris as the ship is burning beside her, and a wave crested over, and she lost grip of the baby and lost the baby into the waves. And you just, talk about bringing a story to life. If this is your ancestor, a kind of getting an understanding of what their experiences were during that voyage.
Absolutely amazing. And really one of a kind sorts of records, aren't they?
They really are, because you're not going to find those kind of details in a passenger list. They're not going to have interviews with somebody that just landed on the shores, or they're not going to describe a joyful reunion between a brother and sister. I just read a immigration article just the other day where a brother and a sister reunited in New Orleans who hadn't seen each other for 12 years. And it described this joyful reunion, and they didn't recognize each other because it had been so long. And these are just wonderful, rich stories that can really help you put together your ancestor story.
And we could find newspaper articles at the port of arrival as well, couldn't we?
Oh, that is such a great tip. Because if you had an ancestor, let's just think of an example here. If you had an ancestor that arrived in New York City in August of 1906, and you went to the New York papers, you will learn that the city was experiencing a terrible heat wave. It was like, I think, 106 degrees.
Oh my gosh.
And the New York Tribune reported that there were ships that arrived at Ellis Island, and they arrived on a Sunday, and Ellis Island port of arrival was closed. So the passengers had to wait in the sweltering holds of the ship and wait for Ellis Island to open. And so the paper reported that by the time that Ellis Island reopened the following day, these mothers and children were disembarking, coming out of the holds of the ship and collapsing from the heat. Now, if this is your ancestor, you suddenly have this whole story and narrative, and you connect and you realize that the sacrifices and what these immigrant ancestors endured to come and immigrate, and now we stand on their shoulders.
What an incredible story. And you're right. Where else would you hear that? Well, I know that you write for newspapers.com and help people use the website and learn more about these kinds of stories. Tell folks where they can find you.
Well, you can check out our blog, which is blogs@newspapers.com. It's called Fish Wrap. If you Google Fish Wrap, you will find our blog. And we try to fill that blog with amazing tips and stories and things that would be interesting for people who are learning to use newspapers or experienced newspaper users.
Excellent. And everybody can become an experienced newspaper user at newspaper.com, because you guys have a free trial. Is that right? So they can just go in and sign up for an account and use it for 7 days for free?
Absolutely. They can just go to newspapers.com, sign up for a 7-day trial, check it out, see if you can find your ancestors, see if you can locate some of those gems that will help you break through those genealogical roadblocks. This is a great way to enrich the story that you're trying to tell with your vital records.
Jenny Ashcraft, thank you so much for joining us here on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been so fun.
This episode is brought to you by newspapers.com. Discover your mom in the paper when you search newspapers.com. Find the stories that made her who she is today by searching the largest online newspaper archive. Newspapers.com makes it easy to find your mom, grandma, and others in the papers. Search more than 945 million pages from major news titles to small-town papers. You can uncover birth and marriage announcements, obituaries, photos, and much, much more. Explore papers dating back to 1690 or as recent as last month. Newspapers.com is used by millions of people every month for genealogy, historical research, and more. Find something that you like? With newspapers.com, it's a snap to save and share articles with family and friends or attach them directly to your ancestry tree. Use promo code Genealogy Gems, altogether no spaces, Genealogy Gems, for a 20% discount on your subscription. That's code Genealogy Gems, and celebrate the stories of a lifetime with newspapers.com. Today's episode is sponsored by MyHeritage, a global discovery platform enjoyed by 110 million people worldwide. MyHeritage has it all and offers a full-service experience that bridges your past, present, and future. MyHeritage has developed powerful genealogy tools to enrich your family tree and take your research to the next level. Receive automatic matches to family trees of fellow MyHeritage users and historical records, which provide new details that you can add to your tree. Explore 12 billion historical records to uncover fascinating new insights about your ancestors. Add new information to your family tree in one click. Check your tree for inaccuracies, colorize your black and white photos, and connect with relatives around the globe. MyHeritage makes it all possible and puts the discoveries at your fingertips. I've been colorizing some of my own personal family photos, and not only are they beautiful, but in many of the photos, it's actually been revealing more details so I can see more of my family history. Growing your family tree is easier than ever before with MyHeritage. The discoveries are out there and waiting to be made. Visit myheritage.com and try it today. That's myheritage.com. Today we are talking obituaries and the important role that they play in your genealogy. Now, obituaries can reveal a lot of really interesting information about your ancestors. And in the article, A Genealogist's Guide to Finding and Using Historical Obituaries, which was published in the Family Tree magazine, author Shannon Combs explains everything you need to know about using and finding obituaries. And good news, she's here right now to tell us more. Hi, Shannon.
Hi, Lisa. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for being here. It's so good to see you again. I know you're a busy lady. This is a terrific article, and I just think of obituaries as being such a cornerstone of the work that we do. It's often one of the first places people start, right?
Yeah, it is. They're pretty accessible for most people. Sometimes you have to dig a little deeper, the further back in time you go. But they seem to be one of the basic, I guess you could call staples, bread and butter type documents that genealogists try to find.
Exactly. And we typically find them in newspapers. So I'd love to start there because obituaries are not the only kind of death record we're finding in newspapers, right?
No, it's not. There can be actually several different types of death records published in a newspaper. Of course, the obituary is the most common, but you can also have funeral announcements. So you might not get the obituary, but maybe you can find that the announcement that this funeral home is servicing this family, or that the wake will occur at such and such place, or the religious ceremony will occur at this church with graveside services. In addition to that, you sometimes can find were called for a long time cards of thanks, where families would put articles in the newspaper, essentially in the advertisement, personal type section, thanking people for coming and participating in the service of their loved one. So there's a wide variety of different types of information that if you don't know it's there, no reason to go look for it.
Exactly. I remember I was doing some newspaper research in the British newspaper archives for my husband's family, and I was floored. Now, this isn't really a death notice, but it's death related, and there was an entire coroner's inquest published in the newspaper. Yeah. And I didn't realize that we could find something like that. So it's wonderful to see the kinds of information that surround the death of a person that could be found in newspapers.
Right. And those aren't as common here in the United States, but right. If your loved one died in a larger city, you can sometimes find those in the newspapers. I was doing some research and found from San Francisco, and they have published books of coroner's inquests. So they're not in newspapers, but the announcement was in the newspaper that there was an inquest. And then I could go to the library. Thankfully, these were all digitized, and find them online where I would find all sorts of information about the person, their family, the circumstances of their death. And if you're doing family medical histories, sometimes those can be real gold mines.
Yes. Well, okay. So let's take a moment and talk about the history of obituaries, because, when we understand, as you know, the history of any kind of genealogical record, then we do a lot better job of utilizing it. So give us a little bit of a background story on obituaries. How long have they been around?
Sure. So you can find obituaries in even some of the earliest colonial newspapers here in the United States. Simply, sometimes they were, somebody passing through, or information from, they had died abroad and it has come back, and there might be a little note in a paper. In the early 1800s, it's going to sound kind of strange, but you can see themes developing around newspaper obituaries. And sometimes, if it was a very important person to the community, you're going to be more than likely to find it. And sometimes unfortunately, I should say, these early newspaper obituaries, they don't have a lot of family information, but you'll find all sorts of virtuous prose written about them, I guess you could say, because they were, talking about, how godly and worthy they were and those types of things. Then the obituary started to morph and actually became a part of the personals and advertisement section of the newspaper. So one reason you may not find information in an obituary for your ancestor is because the family didn't have the money to pay for the obituary to be put in. And if they weren't a real prominent person, they wouldn't get the, prime real estate in the actual reading sections. And so, if your family were on the poorer side, you might not find anything about them, unfortunately. And then as the 20th century came in, it started once again not necessarily a celebration of death, but a celebration of people's accomplishments. Mm-hmm. So you start finding late 1800s into the early 20th century is how the obituary as we know it today started to evolve. It went from maybe 1 or 2 lines about a person dying to, 3 and 4 paragraphs about them, their families, especially if they had, been a pensioner or a veteran, were a pioneer of a town. The early 20th century saw a lot of those people who had, really struck it out west for their fame and fortune, start passing away in those towns. And sometimes you would even find the obituary not only in the place where they died, but in their hometowns back further to the east. So you might find obituaries, especially for those, I guess, pioneering folk, you could call them, back where they came from.
That's a great point. And that's really kind of a nice newspaper research clue, because I think it even expands beyond obituaries, which is that idea of people often started back east, but then relocated out west. And those, particularly I think with the telegraph coming into play, they could send that article back and get it to all those people who would be really interested to know whatever happened to that person.
Right. And of course, now in the 21st century, we're moving more and more away from print newspapers for the obituaries, and we're going to almost completely digital newspapers for the obituaries and digital obituary sites. I know when I've had several of my close family members in the last 10 years who have passed away, the funeral homes are even offering to put obituaries on their sites. And when my mother passed away, I was speaking with the funeral home director, and they had kept records. This was in Texas, and they had records going back several decades with written obituaries that, if you called the funeral home, you could see if they had a written up, not necessarily was ever published in the paper because the family couldn't afford it, but the funeral home had it.
How interesting. Gosh, it really drives home that point that you got to know what kind of time frame you're looking at, right, to see what you would expect to find and where you'd expect to find it. And I would imagine it's true that in small towns, you might be more likely to find obituaries than perhaps in Chicago.
Yeah, because, everybody knows everybody, small hometown newspaper. Those would be more likely to have the longer, more in-depth information written about a person, talking about their family and their, where they came from, what they did, if they were the pillar of a community or even just, a local farmer. And then the cities are, unfortunately, unless you were a prominent citizen, that's where you're more than likely to find a paragraph or less, maybe only even a few sentences, first and last name, age, died on this date. That may be all you get, unfortunately.
Oh, okay, good. Well, so let's talk about where to find these historical newspapers.
Sure.
Where do we start?
Okay, well, there's a lot of different newspapers online. Of course, the Library of Congress Chronicling America is a great start. Start there, see if one of your local newspapers or the place that you're researching local to that, see if they have a newspaper for the time frame out there. One, because it's free. You got to start with the free sources first. Family Search also has a free historical obituary site that you can search. And then you can move into the paid sites. They all have, obviously, newspapers and then obituaries as a part of it. Sometimes you can also contact the local library for the place the person had died. I've had good luck calling, I'm originally from Indiana, and calling around to the various county libraries. And unfortunately, they don't have a lot of the newspapers digitized, but, for a small fee, they were willing to send me a photocopy. And in some cases now I can get emailed PDFs for a few dollars and to support the local library, I'm okay with doing that because our local libraries need a lot of support. So don't give up if you can't find it digitized, is what I'm trying to say. There's a lot of information. There's a lot of places out there, especially for older newspapers. But, just you'd be resourceful, I guess you could say.
Well, and you talked about online indexes. So sometimes we don't get the actual obit, right? But we get enough information out of the index that we could then go track it down in person.
Yeah, that's very true. I've used those several times. One of the links that is in the article is to the Dayton, Ohio index. And you can put in as much information as you know. Sometimes I find it's easier to start with a little bit of information and then, sort through and add details to weed through the large number. But all it will give you is the person's name, the date of publication, so not even the date of death, so it's somewhere in that time frame, and then the page, issue, column number, so that you can contact the Dayton Public Library and they can help get you the paper. And there's a lot of the libraries are like that.
Wonderful. When you do online searches for obituaries, do you tend to just go in straight and do a search on the name, or do you go into the card catalog and really find newspaper and obituary collections and then try to search? Do you have any special tactics that you use to try to make sure you're successful?
That was actually a really great question, because I think it's going to be it depends. If I have a really unique name, and I am pretty sure of the location, maybe time frame of the death, sometimes I'll just start looking for that person, especially, like I said, if it's a really unique name. I had an ancestor named Bathsheba Kelly. So I'm thinking there's not many people named Bathsheba. So I was pretty confident maybe if I just started looking for her and about the time frame she died in Ohio, we'd be good to go.
Yeah.
Other times, I first want to narrow it down, because you don't want to just go searching willy-nilly, right? That's going to waste a lot of time. try to find like a 5-year, maybe a 10-year span if you're not quite too sure, but you have a time frame that'll help weed them down. If it's unfortunately like a common name, you need to add in a lot more, maybe those advanced searches. It may take you going town by town or year by year as you go, weeding through all the names. But if there is an index or a database like that, I do like to use those first because that can help weed out a lot of information right off the bat. And then, print it out, write it down, keep it on the separate frame or tab or whatever you need to, so you can actually then go, okay, I'm going to go to this page and this issue, okay, that there, this page and this issue, and it can really help.
Excellent.
And don't give up.
I agree with that. Never give up, never surrender, right?
That's right.
So when you're searching, I know I had an experience once where I went into a newspaper in California, and I was actually looking through a microfilm. And I knew that obituaries were always on page 7 because I just had been through so many issues of this particular newspaper. And I'm looking on the date when it would have been the next issue following the death of my great-grandfather, and he wasn't there. And I was like, what? So I skipped the next week, and I went back a week. Maybe I got the date wrong. Turned out he was on the front page. And that goes back to you saying, some people were kind of considered the pioneer of the town, even though in the family, he wasn't Mr. Celebrity or anything, but he was revered for that. And they had him on the front page. So I'd love to have you touch on when you don't see them where you think you're going to see them, what's some of the timing that we could expect as to when obits get published, and any other tips on when they're not where you think they'll be? What other kinds of places within the paper do you tend to find these kinds of articles?
Okay. Yeah, that's actually a really good question again. So it's one of those, I guess you could say it's an I depend. One, like you said, even if you don't think that your family member was someone famous, if you're not finding them where you expect to find them, I've had to go, cover to cover of the newspapers. Yeah. Sometimes if your ancestor died of mysterious circumstances, there might not be an obituary, but there might be a court case about it. Right. So that's always a good thing to know. Because those death records, especially, if it was salacious gossip, it's going to turn up somewhere.
That's true. It's newsworthy.
That's right. If it's newsworthy, it's going to be in there. So I was recently doing some research on professional genealogists because I wanted to find out when genealogists, became professional, started becoming an employment type of thing here in the United States. And so I figured an obituary would give me, if they were 80 years old when they died, let's say, I can kind of backtrack to when, maybe they became a professional. And I did not find these obituaries in the late 1800s where I thought they should be. Sometimes they were in the personal section. Sometimes they were in the miscellaneous advertisement section. But then once again, it goes back to somebody had to pay the newspaper to put this in it. So they wouldn't be, in these larger newspapers. I was looking in like the New York Times and the Hartford newspaper and the Boston Globe and the Washington Post, Chicago Tribune. I wasn't finding these obituary pages for them. I was kind of finding in the personal section, which kind of threw me for a loop a little bit.
Yeah. Kind of almost have to follow the money, right?
Yeah.
Figuring out how people got paid. So interesting that you're talking about the history of genealogists, because I remember it was quite a few years ago, I went into the census records and started searching on that as the occupation or the industry. That's really interesting too, how you clusters of people and who was doing it, 100 years ago.
Yeah.
Interesting. Time frame. So obituaries were not always published the very next week, right?
Right. So a lot of people think that, I guess, one, it depends on the religion and the culture that you're looking at, what was, done in that time frame or in that place. And this might sound kind of odd to some of us who don't live in really cold places, but, when the ground freezes in our northernmost states, Sometimes you wouldn't be able to bury somebody until the next spring. And you may have a death notice when they died, but then a full obituary for when the service and the burial took place. So sometimes you may have several month gap in between when they died and when information was published about them in the newspaper. The other thing may be, especially if they were in business or they traveled, or if they were in the military, either or for a merchant vessel, they could have died abroad. And so, but you're only going to hear the information, see the death notice or the obituary when the ship lands again. Right. We didn't have cell phones.
Exactly. Well, okay, so we need to kind of keep an open mind, it sounds like, about where within the pages they might appear, when they would have been published, and also just the fact that there are so many different places where we might be able to find them online. Before I let you go, I'd love to have you talk about, you have in the article kind of this section, the obituary fast facts. What are some of the interesting facts and little bits that you want to share with us?
Sure. Well, some of the things that you can find in an obituary, which can be surprising, we of course, as genealogists, want to find all the family information. We want to know when they were born, who their parents were, if possible, family members, that types of things. But other things that you can find in obituaries are employment information, which can then give you clues to where else they might have been. If they were a migrant to that area, it can give you information, where they originated from. If they immigrated here, sometimes they list, they landed at the port of Philadelphia or New York or New Orleans or wherever, and that can help lead to information for passenger lists and future information. But most importantly, anybody who's listed in that has to be somebody known to the person, either a friend, a family, a close acquaintance. And so I want to encourage people to not forget those collateral lines, because you might be able to find information looking for them, once again going back to your ancestor.
Great point. Shannon, tell folks a little bit about what you do and how they can learn more about what you work on in the world of genealogy.
Sure. So I'm an author, a lecturer, an educator, full-time student, no, perpetual student, I should say, is what my father would call me. But you can find me at my blog, which is Trials and Tribulations of a Self-Taught Family Historian. I know it's long, but just look for TNT Family History out there. You can also find me on Facebook and LinkedIn and on Twitter. So I've spoke all across the United States. I've even spoke internationally in Scotland and in France for the Heraldic and Genealogical Congress. But I think I come from a background of teachers. So I love educating, writing, lecturing, and helping people learn more about their pasts and about who they are and who their families were. And I guess that's the big thing. It doesn't help that my undergraduate degree was in human genetics, so sometimes I can throw a little bit of that DNA in there.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Shannon Combs-Bennett, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining me for this Genealogy Gems podcast episode. Again, to get the show notes for this episode, head to genealogygems.com. In the menu under the free podcast, you'll see a list starting with the most recent episode, and there you will find the show notes page with all the details, all the links to things we talked about. And for you premium members, you're going to be able to download that PDF cheat sheet. If you are not a Genealogy Gems premium member yet, then I would suggest go check that out. Head to our website. You'll find a red button on the homepage or go under premium in the menu, and you can become a member. It lasts all year long, and it gives you access to hundreds of videos, podcast episodes that are exclusively available for premium members, as well as the downloadable cheat sheet for all of our content. So our free episodes, our free videos, they as well have these downloadable PDF cheat sheets, and those are exclusive for premium members. So we'd love to have you join us. And finally, stay in touch with us by clicking the red button on the homepage for the newsletter. That's absolutely free. You get a downloadable bonus PDF when you first sign up for that. And it's a great way for us all to stay in touch. I'd love to hear from you. Send me an email at genealogygemspodcast@gmail.com and let me know what you'd like to hear on the show or comments that you have about the show. And on each of the show notes page, we also have a comments section. That's a great place to share your ideas and your feedback on what you're hearing here at Genealogy Gems. Thank you so much for listening, my friend. I'll talk to you soon.